Some disappearances feel like missing pages from a household ledger, an absence noted, a search begun, a life quietly overturned. Others leave behind small, ordinary things that refuse to stay ordinary. A stool toppled in the grass, a red thread on a child's blanket, an open window that shouldn't have been open. Those tiny clues are the kind that breed the most disturbing theories, the ones that turn neighborhoods into hunting grounds for suspicion, and that haunt families for decades. Today, we'll walk through two such disappearances. One, a child who vanished from a quiet Tacoma street in 1961, the other, a plant worker who simply stopped existing amid the furnaces of a secretive industrial site in 1984, and examine the darkest, most unsettling explanations investigators and families have wrestled with. If you like deep dive mysteries, subscribe for more. In the story that follows, we begin with Ann Burr, a 9-year-old in a small community, who, on a mild summer night, did not return to her bed. The Burrs were not strangers to ordinary Midwestern faith and routine. They were a family people described as devout, cautious, and anchored to their neighborhood. The street where they lived had the kind of watchful calm where kids left bikes propped against porches and neighbors left doors unlocked. Still, in every community there are small dissonances, an unfamiliar car up the block, a man who watches from a distance, the rumble of a salesman's pitch on a weekly route. In this case, those dissonances multiplied after Ann's disappearance into a pattern of possibilities that would never quite resolve. On the evening she vanished, the household rituals were ordinary enough to anyone who remembers the era. A modest television set in the common room, a window left cracked to accommodate a cable run that had been improvised out the sill, and a small wooden stool which children used as a step to reach the cord. That evening, family members later reported, the house was quiet. The younger children were supposed to be asleep upstairs. Sometime between late night and dawn, Ann did not return to her bed. When daylight came, the scene that greeted her parents and siblings was subtle but stark. The bedroom window was open, the TV cable threaded through the sill, and the stool lay on its side in the yard as if abandoned mid-use. No obvious signs of forced entry, no torn curtains, no scuffle on the floor. A red thread, small, almost trivial, was found nearby, and later the grass beneath the window was found to contain clippings that suggested something had disturbed it. In the immediate sweep of the neighborhood, people described nothing overtly violent, nothing that would explain a child disappearing without a trace. The initial response was enormous. Hundreds of neighbors, volunteers, and uniformed officers combed alleyways and backyards. Searches stretched into days. Canvassing, interviews, door knocks, every tool of the era's missing persons response was used. Signs were posted and prayers offered. But as is common in long unsolved cases, the energy of the early days gave way to a kind of bureaucratic momentum, and the case entered into a pattern of leads, partial follow-ups, and dead ends. Some witnesses were questioned and administered polygraph tests. Some of those tests were interpreted early on as indicating deception, only for subsequent analysis and records to make those results less clear. Polygraphs, historically used but not reliably conclusive, would later play a contested role in how certain suspects and persons of interest were portrayed to the public. A prison inmate from another state, years later, would write a letter alleging a burial site linked to Ann, an allegation that prompted dig and search efforts, but ultimately produced no verifiable remains. That claim, like several others, would drift into the space between hope and skepticism. Small physical details became oversized in public imagination. The stool lying on its side became more than wood and nails. It suggested an abrupt exit, a hurried lifting out of the house. The presence of a red thread, perhaps from clothing, took on the weight of a clue and of a chronology. The cable running through the window, installed to bring television into a child's room, became a silent engineering of opportunity, an unexpected opening through which someone might have reached. Each item by itself could be explained away. Together they formed a lattice for darker theories to take root. The first, and for many the least speculative theory, was the simplest: a local abductor or a voyeur who escalated into taking a child. In this scenario, the person was already familiar with the neighborhood rhythm, maybe a figure seen lingering by the corner store, or someone who had been watching children play from a distance. Neighbors later told reporters about an odd mix of characters who frequented the area: men who appeared at odd hours, a traveling cookware salesman who parked in strange places, a neighbor described by some as youthful who had been seen peeking from his porch. Those small accounts, none definitive on their own, layered into a composite portrait of someone opportunistic, someone who could have used the open window and the stool to reach in and pull a child away in a moment when the household's attention was elsewhere. What gives this scenario credence is the absence of forced entry and the lack of struggle reported in the room. From a behavioral standpoint, abductors who plan an assault rarely force a door or windows unless they expect to be interrupted. More common are quick, surprise actions that rely on the target's stillness or on the assumption that a child's quiet bedroom will not draw attention. Supporters of the local abductor theory point to the cable, the stool, and the absence of any sign of a fight as consistent with a swift, opportunistic abduction.
They also note that in many child abduction cases, the perpetrator is someone with at least a passing degree of familiarity with the child's routines. Someone who knows, for example, that the family keeps a window open to run a cable. Yet there are significant counterpoints. Those who caution against jumping to this conclusion stress that many ordinary households in that era ran cables the same way, and many stools sat near windows without anyone being taken. The bedroom showed no sign of a violent entry, but it also lacked other expected evidence: muddy footprints, fibers attached to a mattress, or smeared marks that would indicate a physical confrontation. If a prowler had lingered near the window, surely a neighbor might have seen a shadow, or a screen might have been torn. None of that definitive corroboration emerged. Investigators at the time separately wrestled with the unreliability of some witness accounts and the natural drift of memory. In the end, the local abductor theory remained plausible, but not airtight, an explanation that fits certain facts, but left others unanswered. A second theory, and one that would grow into a national fascination, ties the disappearance to a serial offender who would later become infamous: Ted Bundy. Bundy lived in the area in the years around Anne's disappearance, and later in life offered claims about earlier killings in places where he had lived or traveled. For many families and for the public, the idea that one of America's most notorious killers might be responsible offers both a terrifying possibility and a perverse kind of narrative closure. Bundy's known patterns, approaching young women in public, using charm and a fabricated injury to gain isolation, and his later admitted or suspected involvement in attacks across states, made any missing person from his early years a focal point for speculation. Those who find merit in the Bundy theory point to one central fact: proximity. Bundy lived within driving distance of the neighborhood during the period in question. His own later statements and confessions in other cases placed him in the general region at relevant times. Some investigators and authors who have studied Bundy's movements have noted overlaps in dates and locations that make the connection at least plausible. Additionally, Bundy's later habit of revisiting and revising his own confessions, sometimes claiming credit for crimes he could not have committed, sometimes suggesting involvement where evidence was thin, added to a cloud of ambiguity that both attracts and repels suspicion. But there are powerful reasons to treat Bundy-linked theories with extreme caution in Anne's case. First, Bundy's later claims about early victims have been widely scrutinized and in many instances remain unverified. He was known to boast to journalists and prison acquaintances about crimes in order to manipulate attention. Second, establishing a direct link requires more than geographic coincidence. It requires physical, testimonial, or circumstantial evidence that withstands scrutiny. In Anne's case, there is no such incontrovertible connection. No witnesses reliably placing Bundy near the Burr home at the decisive moment, no forensic tie, and no documentation that ties him to the neighborhood that night. Investigators must also confront the ethical dangers of pinning a single name to a case for which the facts do not squarely point to that person. Falsely narrowing a case to a celebrity suspect can divert resources from other lines of inquiry and can cause immense pain to families. Finally, Bundy's later habit of making statements that blurred truth and fantasy complicates how one treats any post hoc claim. Unless a claim is corroborated by independent evidence, it remains speculative, powerful in the court of public imagination, weak in a court of law. That caveat, repeated again and again in cold casework, does not make the Bundy hypothesis any less chilling for those who consider it, but it does insist that the theory be framed as that, a theory, not a verdict. A third strand that took hold in the years after Anne's disappearance involved an external confession and the promise of closure that never came. Years after the disappearance, an inmate in another state wrote to authorities alleging knowledge of a burial site and a role in a killing. The letter triggered renewed digs in a rural area that matched the description provided. Volunteers and officials converged on a patch of ground, equipped with shovels and hope. The excavation produced nothing conclusive. No bones, no artifacts tied to the Burr family, no trace that stood up to scrutiny. Yet for a time, the claim reignited public interest and forced authorities to revisit earlier assumptions. This kind of lead is not unusual in enduring cold cases. Prison confessions, jailhouse talk, and letters from those seeking attention often promise breakthroughs that do not materialize. The psychology behind such messages is complex. Some are genuine, born of remorse or a desire to unburden. Others are hoaxes, created for notoriety, or are the result of faulty memories and false certainty. Investigators must treat them with measured professionalism, balancing the chance of resolution against the cost of false hope. In Anne's instance, the inmate's allegation remained uncorroborated and is best described as an unsolved lead, an item that reopened wounds but did not yield proof. Across all these theories, a stubborn ambiguity persisted, the kind that corrodes certainty and encourages speculation. Polygraphs used on certain persons of interest were at times cited by the public and even by some investigators as indicating deception. But polygraphs are historically unreliable and fraught with false positives and interpretive pitfalls. Experts consistently caution that a polygraph result is neither proof of guilt nor exoneration. In Anne's case, the initial interpretation of test results fed headlines and suspicions, only for further scrutiny to reduce the weight those tests carried. The reliance on such instruments reflects a truth about investigatory practice in the mid-20th century. Tools and techniques were adopted with varying degrees of scientific rigor, and the records from that time often require contextual reading. Equally significant were the small investigatory missteps and the administrative gaps that can doom a case long before a confession or a breakthrough is found. Witness statements sometimes contradicted each other. Some interviews were not recorded in a way that allowed for later reevaluation. Leads were pursued partially and then dropped. Over time, landscapes change. Yards are landscaped, houses sold, witnesses move away or die. The possibility of an individual's recollection being shaped by media reports or neighborhood gossip grows with each retelling. Still, families and some retired detectives point to missed opportunities, a piece of clothing that might have been preserved but wasn't, a neighbor's account given only to family members and never formally recorded, a scent dog used years later with limited training. In cold case work, the difference between closure and an open wound is often a matter of timing and procedural thoroughness. What made the Burr family's grief public and persistent was not only the absence of an answer, but the way the absence produced competing narratives. When official statements leaned toward the idea of a possible runaway or an accident, neighbors bristled. When media and true crime enthusiasts floated Bundy or a traveling salesman as the culprit, the family felt both vindicated and re-traumatized by the attention. Don and Bev Burr watched their household transformed into a theater of speculation. Reporters asking whether they had suspected someone, neighbors asserting things they had only half seen, strangers offering consolation that often rode alongside assumption. For every theory that made sense on paper, there remained an equal and opposing set of reasons to doubt it. In the years after the disappearance, the family made solemn attempts to keep memory and hope alive. Birthdays were marked, anniversaries remembered. Siblings, Mary, Julie, Greg, grew into adults with the quiet, defining ache of missing a sister. Their lives carried on in ways that those outside the family could not fully see, the small rituals of honoring a life whose details felt suspended in 1961. Publicly, the case moved into the files designated open and unsolved, the language intended to preserve the possibility of future discovery, but which also acknowledged its liminal status. Between the physical clues and the institutional gaps, a final and perhaps most unsettling theory took shape in private conversations, that the disappearance had been enabled by a thin social infrastructure. Neighbors who saw but did not act, officers who misfiled a lead, community systems that assumed safety where vulnerability existed. This is not a single-person theory as much as a communal one, that the worst outcome was allowed by a series of small neglects. The idea is less cinematic than the serial killer hypothesis and less tidy than the confession that led to a clean excavation. Instead, it points to human fallibility, an accumulation of small oversights creating the space where one life could vanish. That notion, collective vulnerability, has its own evidentiary anchors. Investigators recall moments when a tip might have been logged but not followed. Neighbors recall statements made in passing and not taken seriously. Yet this explanation is also hard to prove definitively. It indicts systems more than individuals, suggesting that sometimes closure remains out of reach not because of a single monstrous act, but because of the slow erosion of focus and resources that every community experiences. It is difficult to prosecute systems. It is not always possible to point to a single actor and say, here is where this went wrong.
As years turned into decades, the case lingered in public imagination, in part because each of these theories, opportunistic abductor, serial offender, false confession, and institutional failure, carried with it a particular kind of horror. The serial offender angle promises a predator at large. The abductor theory offers a chillingly ordinary explanation of how a moment can become a tragedy. And the cover-up or institutional neglect idea forcefully reminds people that sometimes the most devastating truths are procedural and human rather than cinematic. None of these theories has been definitively established in Anne's case. Each remains a candidate in the court of possibilities, a hypothesis measured and measured again. Even as investigators archived leads and families aged, the physical items retained a stubborn presence. The stool, the cable, a fragment of red thread, these objects continued to anchor stories and memories. For the family, they were not forensic curiosities. They were the last tangible connections to a child who should have grown up and lived a life. That personalization complicates every public theory. When a suspect is floated in news reports, even as a hypothetical, a family hears it as a potential solution and as a possible misdirection. The human dimension, parents, siblings, neighbors, shapes how evidence is interpreted and how theories are lived with. There is a specific tension that reappears in interviews with retired detectives and with the Burr family themselves, a desire for clear answers tempered by a fear that clarity will not be clean.
A definitive arrest would be justice and would end decades of speculation. Yet even that would not fully repair the quiet violences of loss and time. Conversely, definitive exoneration of popular suspects would not return a life. The family has lived in the gray zone, cautious about rumors, persistent in urging for new inquiries, and resigned in the face of an evidentiary record that resists finality. Toward the close of the Burr story's first major chapter came the prison letter that, for a moment, reframed everything. The letter's author supplied a location and a sequence of events that seemed specific enough to merit excavation. Volunteers and officers worked together to dig, to feel with shovels and metal detectors for a trace that might prove the claim. The search illuminated practical frustrations that accompany aging investigations, chain of custody questions, changes in property ownership, and the ethical obligation to conduct searches that could disturb a peaceful landscape. When nothing was found, the disappointment was raw. For those who had allowed themselves the dangerous comfort of hope, the federal absence of remains was devastating. For others, it was proof that the case required a different direction entirely. That is where the narrative of Anne's disappearance sits, threaded through with mundane objects that acquired enormous symbolic weight, buffeted by competing explanations that vary in plausibility and cruelty, and held open by the simple fact of absence. The most disturbing theories in this case are not necessarily the most sensational. They are the ones that remain stubbornly possible, that could explain the elements at hand, yet do not yield the conclusive evidence necessary to move from suspicion to resolution. And yet, the absence of resolution feeds the imagination in predictable ways. When a notorious name appears near the timeline, the public is quick to attach it to the unknown. When a prisoner claims knowledge, the media cycles through hope and rebuke. When a quiet neighborhood is revealed to have peculiar characters, the community rewrites its own history in search of an explanation. The physics of a missing person case, small clues, human fallibility, and elapsed time, conspire to ensure that the most disturbing theories persist not because they are proven, but because they help fill blanks in human understanding. As the Burr family continued to mark years and anniversaries, some efforts to keep the case alive shifted into modern tools. Cold case units occasionally reviewed the files, and occasional media interest would resurface old documents. But the primary experience for the family was chronic grief, a life marked by an unfillable absence, a child frozen at 9. The public theories, whether believable or implausible, could never fully encompass that private, continuous loss. Across the decades and the miles, another disappearance would come to embody a different set of nightmares. An industrial environment, a culture of secrecy, and the unnerving possibility that a man could be consumed, in some literal sense, by the machinery of the place where he worked. In a way, that case is the inverse of Anne's. Where her disappearance was marked by small, domestic details, the other one was defined by technical anomalies, institutional opacity, and the particular terrors that arise when a workplace is designed to contain dangerous materials. The two stories are not the same, but they share an anatomy of ambiguity, slender physical clues, contested official statements, and families left to imagine the worst. Before we move to that second case in detail, it is worth pausing on the Burr Files' central lesson. Disturbing theories gain traction when ordinary things, an open window, a misplaced stool, a length of red thread, resist ordinary explanations. The theories that endure are those that seem to stitch those small things into a coherent narrative of wrongdoing or failure. In Anne's case, each of the prevailing theories does that imperfectly. None clinches the story. Each offers a version of what might have happened, and each carries implications that ripple outward from a single unresolved loss. And then there are the human costs of living amid theory. Living with the known unknowns, they create a pressure on daily life. A neighbor's glance becomes a question. A passing truck reawakens an image. Birthdays become markers of a time stopped. For Mary, Julie, and Greg, the not knowing became part of the texture of adulthood, a grief that had no timeline and no proper ritual closure. For Don and Bev Burr, it meant carrying forward in a world that felt less safe than it had when they tucked their children into bed. The public gaze sometimes confuses these private rhythms with narrative urgency. Reporters chase theories because they are stories. True crime audiences parse possibilities because they seek pattern. But in homes where loss is real, theory is not entertainment. It is either a knife that reopens wounds, or at best a thin reed of hope. That moral economy is worth remembering whenever one measures the relative plausibility of a theory against the suffering it produces. After years of intermittent attention, the Burr case receded from front-page awareness. Files rested, new technologies advanced, and public interest moved on. But the quiet signals, like that stool and the thread, remained lodged in the archives and in memory. And then, decades later, someone would point to another kind of ambiguity, a disappearance that occurred not on a front porch, but in the belly of an industrial complex. The mechanisms were different, but the pattern was eerily familiar. Small anomalies, institutional secrecy, and theories that were as dark as they were plausible.
The second case began in a place designed for containment, a plant where work was done with materials that required caution, where doors were locked, where processes involved furnaces that reached extreme temperatures. Stories out of such places rarely leak in full, and when they do, they force observers to read ordinary incidents, keys left in a locker, a tool set on a bench, with a new, uneasy attention. The whispers that cluster around these environments tend to favor institutional explanations, accidents hidden, records smudged, and reputations defended. What investigators and families would later call the most disturbing theory in that case did not hinge on heroic sleuthing. It hinged on a possibility that the processes that made the plant functional could also be used, deliberately or not, to obliterate a person's trace. Engineers and plant workers would disagree on the plausibility of certain mechanics. Union members, supervisors, and federal inspectors would offer conflicting memories. And, as with Anne's case, ordinary objects, this time a bent key, a torn boot toe, an alligator clip, would take on disproportionate meaning. We will follow that story next, examining the timeline, the mechanical anomalies, and the theories that suggest something far darker than an on-the-job accident. The parallels to Anne's case are not merely thematic, they are methodological. In both, small physical signs are interpreted in the shadow of institutional behavior. In both, families are left holding pieces that refuse to make a whole. And in both, the most disturbing theories are the ones that seem on balance to line up with the fragments, precise enough to be believable, but still short of definitive proof. But before moving deeper into the industrial case, it is important to note how the Burr file illustrates an investigative truth. Absence invites narrative. When evidence is thin, the human mind stitches. That stitching can be consoling or catastrophic. It can create a focal point for search and advocacy, or it can falsely narrow an inquiry to an individual who had no connection to the event. Any new theory must therefore be tested against two tests. Does it explain the physical facts better than alternatives, and does it do justice to the lived reality of those who remain bereaved? With that in mind, the second story awaits. A man last seen at work, a furnace whose registers faltered at an odd hour, and the discovery of personal items in a place where retrieval is difficult and the truth can be buried under heat and institutional silence. The details complicate the immediate leap to conclusion. Engineers raise doubts about whether a human could have been processed the way some allege, supervisors cite safety protocols that would have made self-entry unlikely, and records are sometimes conflicting or incomplete.
Still, the presence of charred fragments, of items that belonged to a missing man, and of temperature logs that dipped briefly at the time he disappeared, set the stage for theories that are as technically specific as they are emotionally devastating. We will examine those technical anomalies carefully, what furnace registers can tell us, what engineers say about foreign material in a combustion system, and how claims of whistleblowing and possible retribution feed a narrative of cover-up. We will parse the evidence pro and con, always marking speculation as such, and weigh institutional motive alongside forensic possibility. The goal is to present the most disturbing theories in a way that is rigorous and empathic, acknowledging how easy it is to conflate plausibility with proof. What follows is an attempt to do exactly that. The plant where Dave Box worked was not the sort of place a stranger could wander into and be overlooked. It sat behind fences and checkpoints, a web of buildings and yards that smelled of metal and steam, where men in specialized gear moved with the confidence of people accustomed to hazards. Officially, it was a facility that handled uranium-bearing materials under federal oversight. In practice, it was a workplace shaped by secrecy, hierarchy, and a set of procedures designed to keep dangerous processes tightly controlled. For a long time, that very control was part of what made the idea of a disappearance inside the plant seem implausible to some and horribly plausible to others. Dave was described by coworkers as a reliable, steady employee, someone who knew the rhythms of his station, who could tend equipment, and who sometimes covered shifts when the lines were thin. The week he vanished, there was nothing in his personal life that publicly suggested any imminent, intentional exit. He left his keys on a locker bench, his toolbox in place, and the presence of small personal items in odd locations would later sharpen the unease his family felt. His last confirmed sightings were at the facility. A coworker named Harry drove with him after a shift, and a supervisor, Charlie, was said to have seen him earlier in the day near the furnace area. By the time anyone noticed he was missing, a strange sequence of technical anomalies had already been logged. 3 separate furnace registers showed brief drops in temperature around the same hour that Dave was last seen. Those dips were subtle, minutes long, and not catastrophic in themselves, but in a system calibrated to process materials at precisely controlled heat, they were anomalies that called for explanation. When operators later opened portions of the equipment to perform routine checks, they found items that should not have been in the combustion stream: a fragment from a pair of eyeglasses, the torn toe of a boot, a bent key, an alligator clip used in electrical work, pieces of a handheld radio, and a small length of steel wire formed into 3 interlocking loops. These objects, catalogued in investigative logs, could be mundane, lost tools, flotsam of industrial life, or they could be fragments of a much darker event. Most alarming to family members were the reported charred fragments recovered from the furnace's interior. Those fragments were small and degraded, partly incinerated and chemically contaminated, a condition that complicated identification. Some materials tested as bone-like under preliminary examination, but the results were constrained by the extent of heat exposure and by the facility's contamination profile. Later testing found traces of radioactive contaminants on those fragments, which carried practical and legal consequences. Human remains that were contaminated with radiation are handled under strict protocols, and they may not be returned for burial in the same way uncontaminated remains would be. For Dave's family, the knowledge that whatever had been found could not be treated as a normal set of remains added a layer of indignity to the already unbearable absence. The official record from the time reflects a baffling mix of acknowledged anomalies and institutional reticence. Plant managers maintained that procedures would have made deliberate self-entry into furnace lines unlikely without immediate detection. Engineers testified, both publicly and in off-the-record conversations, that the mechanical process by which materials are fed and the surveillance systems around key equipment made a straightforward explanation of accidental ingestion or suicide problematic. Yet the presence of personal items in the furnace, combined with temperature logs that coincided with Dave's last known movements, left investigators and family members asking an unavoidable question: could human intent or malice have been disguised as industrial mishap? 2 disturbing theories rose to the top of public and private speculation, and both are rooted in plausible mechanics even as they remain unproven. The first theory is the suicide hypothesis, that Dave somehow entered the furnace or its feed system intentionally. Supporters of this view sometimes point to workplace accidents elsewhere and to the documented incidents of individuals choosing on-site suicide in other industrial settings. But this theory clashed with multiple practical considerations. Engineers familiar with the plant's design emphasized that access points were secured and that a person inside the furnace feed stream would be likely to trigger alarms, damage conveyors, or leave unmistakable signs beyond a few small artifacts. Coworkers who knew Dave argued that his behavior in the days and weeks prior showed no pattern consistent with suicidal planning. In short, while suicide is a straightforward explanation on paper, the physical and behavioral evidence made it seem unlikely to those who examined the mechanics closely. The second, and for many the more unsettling, theory posits foul play and a possible institutional cover-up.
In this scenario, the furnace, normally a tool of industrial processing, might have been used as a means of disposing of a body, intentionally or by staging a narrative of accident. Proponents of this theory point to 3 lines of concern. First, the facility had documented a culture of secrecy and a chain of command that sometimes prioritized production and reputation over transparency. Second, later federal investigations would reveal environmental violations and lapses in safety reporting. These documented failings suggested that institutional misconduct was not entirely hypothetical. Third, the physical evidence, the temperature anomalies, the placement of personal items, and the contaminated fragments could be read as consistent with an object, and possibly a human body, entering the furnace at a specific time and being processed. Those elements alone do not prove a criminal act. There were clear counterarguments. Plant management and some engineers noted that objects can enter combustion systems in unexpected ways. Maintenance equipment can be inadvertently left in process zones, items can fall from conveyor systems, and the process of cleanup can relocate objects. Investigators also faced practical limitations. The presence of contamination complicated forensic analysis. Heat degrades DNA, and the logistic constraints of recreating the exact thermal and material circumstances decades or even months after the fact made it difficult to draw definitive conclusions about what had happened. Moreover, there was no eyewitness account of a struggle or of someone being forced into equipment. No supervisor confessed to seeing anything suspicious. No direct chain of custody evidence linked a suspect to the furnace at the critical moment. Then there was the allegation that Dave had acted as a whistleblower, or at least that he had knowledge of practices at the plant that threatened compliance with safety or environmental rules. Some former employees later said that workers tended to keep quiet about certain shortcuts or irregularities, and that those who raised concerns sometimes faced retaliation. If Dave had been outspoken, or if someone suspected him of threatening to speak to outside regulators, that could provide a motive for silencing. But motive is not proof. The suggestion that a worker might be targeted by management or coworkers carries with it a particularly explosive moral dimension, and it is the sort of claim that demands evidentiary rigor. In this case, no clear documentary trail has emerged to show a deliberate, administratively sanctioned scheme to dispose of a person. Part of why the cover-up theory gained traction is the pattern of later discovery around the site. After the facility's primary mission wound down, federal audits and environmental reviews revealed lapses that were then publicly documented, unreported spills, inadequate containment in certain processes, and record-keeping that did not meet contemporary standards.
Those findings do not retroactively validate any single claim about Dave's disappearance, but they do change the backdrop. A workplace once defended as fail-safe later proved to have systemic problems. For the bereaved, this late-arriving evidence lends plausibility to the idea that management might have had incentives to minimize scandal. For investigators, it complicates the narrative because it suggests motives layered into a corporate and governmental setting, rather than a simple interpersonal crime. Technical testimony illustrates this uncertainty. Some engineers simulated scenarios in which non-biological items could enter the furnace and produce temperature dips without creating alarms. Small, brief occlusions that the system would record as anomalous, but not catastrophic. Others argued that introducing a human body, even in stages, would likely produce telltale mechanical disruptions and downstream evidence beyond the fragments recovered. The presence of a small looped wire remains particularly puzzling. Such an item is not a common manufacturing scrap in the plant's processes and might have belonged to a radio or personal item, yet how and when it entered the combustion stream has never been clearly established. Each technical assertion arrived with a caution. Models are approximations.
Recollections by far-shifted staff are fallible, and processes evolve over time. Investigators also pointed to administrative choices that complicated a clear resolution. Some records from the period were incomplete or inconsistent. Surveillance footage, if it had existed in a form useful to criminal investigators, was either not preserved or not comprehensive enough to show who had accessed critical areas at precise times. In addition, early investigative decisions shaped the trajectory of inquiry, whether the case should be treated as a missing person, an industrial accident, or a possible homicide determined which agency led the inquiry and what forensic tools were applied. That kind of jurisdictional ambiguity can, in practice, limit what gets examined and how aggressively certain leads are pursued. Another layer of complexity comes from the public statements of those who were present in the years after the disappearance. Some former employees told journalists that plant culture discouraged speaking to outsiders and that the workforce preferred to handle problems internally. Others insisted there had been no conspiracy and that any conclusion about foul play was speculative. That divergence reinforces a painful truth about such cases. People with access to the same facts can interpret them in radically different ways, and much hinges on who we choose to trust. For Dave's family, the consequences were concrete and heartbreaking. Without clear remains that could be ceremonially returned, and without a narrative of closure, they were left in a legal and emotional limbo.
The identification process for the fragments that were recovered was protracted and ultimately limited by contamination and by the degraded state of the material. Even when some analyses suggested human tissue, the classification of portions of the material as hazardous waste meant that normal disposition was curtailed. The family was told that certain evidence could not be released for traditional burial or memorial services, a bureaucratic reality that compounded grief with a sense of indignity. There were also moments of institutional defensiveness that hardened suspicion. When law enforcement and plant officials described the event as a tragic accident or an unresolved industrial incident rather than a likely homicide, family members and some outside observers felt that the narrative leaned too quickly toward minimizing responsibility. Others argued that law enforcement had to follow evidence rather than speculation, and that charging anyone without solid forensic proof would have been untenable. Again, both sides of that debate are rooted in reasonable concerns: the need to avoid wrongful accusation and the equally moral imperative to thoroughly examine the possibility of wrongdoing. Through the years, attempts at renewed inquiry surfaced intermittently. Media reports revived public interest. Civil suits and environmental lawsuits cast light on corporate practices, and at times retired engineers or supervisors gave interviews that hinted at knowledge they had not previously shared. Yet despite sporadic scrutiny, no single development produced the sort of definitive, court-tested evidence necessary to reach a legal conclusion. The case entered the class of disappearances whose alchemy resists neat endings. Technical anomalies, plausible motives, and institutional opacity combine to create an explanation that feels credible in pieces but resists being assembled into a whole that meets the standard of proof. That unresolved status mirrors the pattern in the Burr case in one crucial respect. Both families were left to hold fragments, physical, documentary, and emotional, and to live with the persistent question of whether the most disturbing theory is true. For the Burrs, the terrifying possibilities clustered around a stranger in a neighborhood or the specter of a serial offender. For Dave's family, the darkest hypothesis suggested the machinery of an institution might have been used, or at least could have been used, to erase a life. Both narratives share a feature that complicates closure. The evidence available is just sufficient to make a theory plausible, but not sufficient to establish it as fact. Why do these particular theories endure? Part of the answer is cognitive. Humans look for patterns and agents. When faced with absence, it is more satisfying and more terrifying to imagine a perpetrator than to accept random misfortune.
Another part is institutional. Opaque organizations with motives to protect reputation create fertile ground for suspicion. Finally, the physical artifacts themselves, the stool, the red thread, the looped wire, anchor imagination. Small objects offer concrete hooks for narrative, and narratives give shape to grief. In both cases, there is also an ethical dimension to how we talk about theories. Speculation can spur new leads. It can also inflict collateral harm. Families live their grief in public when narratives get traction. Accused or suspected persons see their reputations damaged by association, even where proof is lacking. Responsible inquiry, therefore, demands a balance, an openness to the disturbing possibilities that the evidence suggests, and a commitment to precise, cautious language that separates what is suggested from what is established.
If any practical lesson emerges from these two stories, it is that the machinery of investigation matters as much as the machinery of harm. Timely preservation of evidence, clear custodial records, thoughtful application of technical resources, and institutional transparency can mean the difference between resolving a disappearance and leaving a family to search forever. When those gears misalign, when records are incomplete, when culture discourages speaking up, when testing is limited by contamination, then the darkest theories gain traction precisely because they are not easily disproved. Ultimately, the most disturbing theories about vanished people endure not because they are proven, but because they answer a pressing human need to explain the unexplainable. They offer a narrative that fits the fragments, even while insisting on a finality that the facts may not support. For the Burr family and for Dave Box's relatives, that tension is more than intellectual. It is a daily reality of absence, a series of anniversaries marked without the closure that most rituals provide. For those watching and wondering, the hope is twofold. First, that renewed attention and advances in forensic methods might one day shed new light on stubborn anomalies. Technologies for analyzing degraded materials and digitizing old records have, in other cases, produced breakthroughs decades after events. Second, a plea that institutional actors, whether police departments, corporations, or regulators, recognize the human cost of opacity and the moral value of rigorous, transparent investigation. The most disturbing theories about vanished people are hard to forget because they sit at the intersection of plausible mechanics and moral dread. They invite us to imagine failure at both personal and systemic levels, the human who preys on another, and the institution that fails to protect or to be accountable. Both stories are reminders that small things, a stool, a thread, a bent key, can hold outsized meaning, and that the absence of clear answers can be as harmful as a wrong one. If you have information related to these cases or a story you think we should cover, please use the submission form linked in the description. Consider supporting the channel on Patreon if you'd like to help us continue investigating unresolved mysteries with care and rigor. Thank you for listening. Remember that behind every theory is a real person and a family still living with absence.